Well, one of the principles of modern monetary theory is that a particular value of a fiscal balance, a deficit or a surplus, is a meaningless thing without a context. And it's the context that's important, not the actual figure. And so this idea that has emerged in the neoliberal era, that the actual value of the fiscal balance is something that's all important and can be considered in isolation of a context, is leading to very poor economic decisions being made. There should never be a number set to a target that a government should achieve, because ultimately what we know is that the non-government sector determines the outcome for the government rather than the government. And what I mean by that is that if the non-government sector wants to save a lot of its income, then the deficit has to rise, or else the economy goes into recession. And if the economy goes into recession, and if the non-government sector spending falls and it starts to save more, and the government doesn't immediately respond, then sales fall, inventories in firms rise, firms notice the unsold goods in their warehouses and whatever, their shops, and they start to cut back output because they say there's not enough spending, and they start to lay off workers. And that laying off workers, they lose their income, and then that reverberates in second and third and fourth round effects, the spending multiplier. And so if that happens and the government doesn't respond, well then the government deficit will go up anyway, because the lack of employment will reduce taxation revenue. And in most countries the welfare payments will rise, and so the deficit increases anyway. And that process is called the automatic stabilisers. And so in that sense, it's really the non-government sector spending and saving decisions that drive the overall balance that the government has, not what the government wants to do. That's the first point. The second point is that it makes no sense for the government to think of the fiscal balance in isolation. The purpose of fiscal policy isn't to generate a surplus or a balance or a deficit of 1% of GDP. That's thinking in isolation. The purpose of fiscal policy is that is government spending and taxation. The purpose of that is to ensure there's enough spending in the economy to create full employment and prosperity and allow the non-government sector saving desires to be realised. That's the purpose of fiscal policy. So when you're evaluating the state of the fiscal situation, you're not looking at the number, you're looking at how many people are employed and how prosperous the economy is. And you might have a situation where a deficit of 1% of GDP is appropriate, but another situation when a deficit of 5% of GDP is appropriate. And then again, in some situations, a surplus of 1% of GDP might be appropriate. And how we determine which of those three options is appropriate depends upon what the non-government sector is doing. So for Norway, for example, the non-government sector savings are strong overall. Its government has small surpluses. Why? Because its export sector is so strong. But for most countries that don't have booming export sectors, to be able to allow the domestic non-government sector to save, the government has to run a deficit. That's the fact. And so when we're looking at what's been going on in the Eurozone, you asked me about austerity. Well, all of the economics books I've ever read tell us that if non-government sector spending is falling and there's rising unemployment, then the solution for the government has to be to increase its net spending, its deficit, has to. That's what economic theory tells us. And these statements from Brussels and IMF that we've got to have austerity to restore growth are not economic statements, they're ideological statements. They have no foundation in economics. Cutting government spending at a time when non-government sector spending is falling is the height of irresponsibility. And you know that that's just ideological statements, that they want to limit government, size of government, and force governments to privatise and to cut back on pensions and government employment. So the fact is that it's not just modern monetary theory that says this, all economic theory really says that you should never run pro-cyclical fiscal policy. You always should use fiscal policy to offset non-government sector spending dynamics, not to reinforce them in one direction or the other.